Professor Zatlin is Associate Professor of History at Boston University, where he has been an active teacher and scholar since 2002 and written widely on a range of topics, all of which I cannot name in the time allotted to me: German communism, Soviet-style economic planning, East German automobile industry, and so much more. Of great relevance is his current research, which investigates the link between race and economy in modern European history, focusing on the experience of German Jews. He's completing a book entitled Fantasies of Jewish Wealth in Germany, 1790 to 1990, which analyzes how economic racism inspires violent assaults on the rights of ownership and citizenship. Jonathan will give a lecture on a specific story in the German Jewish economic world that will illustrate the larger story of German Jewish entrepreneurship. After he speaks, David Brown, LBI's Director of Programs and Communications, will lead a discussion with questions and answers from the audience. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I hope and know you'll enjoy this program and spend some time at our virtual exhibit in the near future. Thanks so much, and Jonathan, please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Billy, and thank you to everybody in the audience for attending the talk and the launch of the exhibition. I also want to thank everybody at the Leo Baeck Institute who put the exhibition together, and particularly Billy, Magda Vrobel, Renate Evers, but also to Sophie Rupp for her coordination, and Shana Marchese and Sean Naftel of the Center for Jewish History for designing the website, translating everything that we did into a website. And I also want to thank Heidi Fishman, who is the great-granddaughter of Zacharias Spier, who I'll be talking about a little bit today, and who founded the Wickrather Leather Company. Heidi's been not only willing to discuss her family's history, but also share documents, and some of the pictures, I'm going to share my screen now, that you're going to be seeing are actually taken from her collection. So thank you very much, Heidi. All right. So I want to start by asking a really simple question. Why bother to focus on the Wickrather Lederfabrik? After all, it's not even mentioned in the exhibition itself. Well, one reason is what Billy just said. It gives you a sense, I think, of the long arc of Jewish economic activity in the 19th and 20th centuries and the legal and social obstacles that stood in the way of German Jewish economic activity. Another reason is that the story highlights the Leo Baeck Institute's unique and invaluable collection of documents, which you can find not only in its excellent library, but also in its digitized sources. And I found a couple of things in there that have supported this talk. And finally, the story of this particular leather manufacturer reveals the importance of law in shaping economic behavior, and in particular, the key role of civil rights in making economic prosperity possible for minorities. After all, legal restrictions on the economic activity of German Jews, including their right to live where they wanted, to choose their occupation, and to own property, had made it difficult for most German Jews to earn a living. But the gradual emancipation of Jews during the 19th century opened up new economic activities for German Jews. Permitted to settle where they wanted, they were permitted to settle where they wanted and to enter most professions, and they prospered. And by 1900, most had entered the middle classes. But the relaxation of legal restrictions on German Jewish economic activity did not come all at once. German Jews were granted civil rights gradually and piecemeal, with freedoms often granted and then later rolled back or not enforced. Moreover, as we Americans know very well, formal legal emancipation doesn't always translate into actual equality before the law. Even after Jews were granted full civil rights in the wake of German unification in 1871, bureaucratic restrictions and informal discrimination remained common, especially when it came to serving the state. Even after the Weimar Republic removed the last legal obstacles to full Jewish integration in German society, informal methods of excluding Jews, some organized and some violent, persisted and even increased. In contrast, the Nazis revoked civil rights for Jews, including their rights as citizens, the right to pursue professions, the right to own property, and eventually their right to live. After 1945, these rights were restored to German Jews, and legal mechanisms for returning their stolen property were also created, albeit in a highly contested manner that often led to drawn-out legal battles for restitution and compensation. But as the story of the Wickrather Lederfabrik demonstrates, the restoration of private property in West Germany didn't ensure the viability of German Jewish commercial life. The Nazi assault on German Jewry had made it impossible for many to return to business as usual. And that leads me to conclude that law is a necessary but insufficient condition of commercial success. And that's pretty much what I want to talk about using the example of the Wickrather. This is a picture, it's an oil painting of Zacharias Spier that I found through the Digibeck, the Leo Baeck Institute's digitized source base. And he founded the company in 1855, purchasing a small tannery that specialized in horse hides for leather goods like saddles. By the time he died in 1901, the firm employed 200 employees and had become one of Germany's largest exporters of quality leather goods. Spier was one of 7 children, and I'm just going to show you a series of maps so you can orient yourself here. We're talking about this area right in here that became part of Prussia following the defeat of Napoleon. He's born in this area right here, Rees. Actually, I'm not even sure how to pronounce it, to be honest, in the Duchy of Cleves, and traveled about 110 kilometers south. And here, it's such a small village, Wickrather, that you can't even really see it on this map, but you can see it here. It's not that far from Düsseldorf, actually. And here is Gladbach, which becomes Mönchengladbach over time to distinguish it from other Gladbachs. So the move that he makes, which if I just come back to this map for a second, is from the right bank of the Rhine, not to the left bank of the Rhine, but to this small river right here, the Neos. So that 110 kilometers is made possible because of a more liberal approach to Jewish mobility. When Prussian King Frederick William IV assumes the throne, he relaxes residency restrictions on Prussian citizens in 1842, which means that Jews are permitted to live where they like. Not only that, but Zacharias actually entered the guild and became a journeyman tanner, which is something that was pretty much closed to Jews before this period. It's possible, but not something that one, at least in terms of the documents, can demonstrate. It's possible that he became interested in tanning because he had some older brothers who were involved in trading cattle, but his father also seems to have been interested in tanning. Now, even if Jews are permitted more freedom, it doesn't guarantee that they can always take advantage of those freedoms. Here's an example, an interesting example. This is a personal loan, a record of a personal loan that he takes out from the man who will become his father-in-law, Hieronymus Hirsch. And it's about basically taking out a loan in order to purchase machinery, because that's one of the things that Zacharias Spier understood as a way to promote the productivity of his firm. And what's really interesting about this is you can make the argument that I think is often made in the literature that Jews loan money to each other because they trust each other on the basis of a common religion. And of course, anti-Semites argue that this is all about clannishness. But there's another piece of this too, and that is that a lot of Christians don't want to lend to Jews, either because they don't like Jews or because they mistrust Jews based on anti-Semitic ideas about Jewish dishonesty. Now, as we know, actually, anti-Semitism was an important feature of life. Oh, sorry, this is just a picture of the factory itself from 1870. You can see already in those 5 years that he had dramatically expanded from what was a 2-person workshop within the space of 15 years to an actual factory. But the reason I'm putting this up here is this problem of anti-Semitism. Just to give you a brief example, the mayor of Wickrather tried in the late 1880s to force Zacharias to reapply for his commercial license. And the legal basis for that was dodgy at best. But the argument that the mayor had was that the factory was dumping toxic chemicals from the tanning process, and tanning is a very toxic process, into the river Neos, and that's harming other businesses as well as the residents of the town. So you could argue that this is very simply a modern story of factory pollution and attempts by state authorities, in this case, the municipality, to regulate environmental damage. But the problem is it's not that simple. There are several other tanneries in the area that do the same thing. They dump their chemicals directly, unfiltered, into the water. But municipal authorities only go after Zacharias Spier. Not only that, but several local factory owners testify in court that the pollutants aren't harming their business, which, that could be thin. There's no question about it. It just so happens that they're all Jewish. And that suggests that there is another dimension to the story, that the Jewish community in Wickrather feels beleaguered and discriminated against. And there's certainly not enough evidence to prove that this is true, but it's highly suggestive that there's a lot of discrimination that can't be read directly from legal statutes. Now, Zacharias himself was openly Jewish and engaged with the Jewish community. He was the Gemeindevorsteher, the lay head of the Jewish community in Wickrather, which was not very large, but nevertheless, he was a Reform Jew, and he became very involved in Jewish educational philanthropy, something that both of his, it looks like I dropped out a point, which I'll come up to, or had these in a different order. Okay, I will point out the sons in a minute, then let me just say that both sons were involved in various kinds of Jewish philanthropy, educational philanthropy in particular. So I want to say something, though, about how successful the company became, first under Zacharias and then under his sons, Victor and Louis. I think it's partially his interest in tanning methods and trying to create the most effective tanning methods that would allow the hides not to have to sit in tanning materials for too long, but actually shorten the process while not surrendering the kind of tensile strength that you get from tanning for the hides. But also this purchase of the actual machinery that makes it possible for him to scale his business up. And you can see that in 1889, he takes the company public and he lists it on the Berlin Stock Exchange, and he has to change the name from the Zacharias Spier Gerberei to the Niederrheinische Aktiengesellschaft für Lederfabrikation. And so the NAG, the name changes, but the business itself doesn't change. And this allows him to have access to capital to increase the plant, the equipment, as well as the machines that he wants in more generally. It's worth pointing out, too, that he was actually a really progressive employer, at least for the time. I mean, one has to be a bit careful about this, but he did build subsidized housing, which is what you see here for his factory workers, and also was very involved in establishing social insurance funds both for accidents that might happen on the job, but also pensions for his workers, far in advance and also in excess of what was mandated by law after Bismarck introduced social insurance in Germany. So it's actually quite progressive. At the same time, it's all about the firm. He is trying to care for his workers, and apparently he was, from what one can tell, relationship between the management and employees was pretty good. But obviously, he's also interested in preventing unionization, which was becoming an issue around the turn of the century and becomes a very serious issue for the company right before the First World War. He wants to keep people close to the factory to make sure that they do show up for work and that there's no reliance on transportation, and finally improve productivity by increasing morale. So these are really progressive measures for the time, but at the same time, they're all about the factory. Now, we can talk about the success of the company in a variety of just to pick up, the company starts exporting to European markets, including Turkey and the Americas over time. At the time that Zacharias passes away in 1901, like I said, they employed 200 people, but the company prospers under Victor and Louis's direction, which is unusual because you're talking about the second generation, and very often the second generation of entrepreneurs, there are all sorts of issues about the direction in which the company should be taken. But despite World War I and the hyperinflation, the factory does really well. By 1923, it's employing 500 people, and then by 1933, on the eve of the takeover by the Nazis, it has 600 factory workers. Not only that, but it looks like my slides are all out of whack here for whatever reason. Hold on one second. All right, so this is a picture of Louis on the left and Victor on the far right in 1930, just so you get a sense of who they are. And here is the mansion, or the villa, if you like, the estate that that Zacharias built, but the firm does so well that Victor is able to build onto it in 1926. So you can see the palm tree here, which is fascinating to me. I assume that you have to dig up the palm tree during the winter and put it in some kind of a garden house. But the idea is that you can see it's rather large, but gets even larger and more modern with this addition right here. So the family and the factory are doing quite well. I don't know what's going on with the, okay. When the Nazis take over in 1933, there are almost immediate changes in the legal framework that governs economic relations, particularly between the state and the private sector. And a lot of municipalities begin excluding Jews in all sorts of informal ways on top of whatever legal restrictions on Jewish commercial conduct are introduced. So for example, municipalities, and this includes Wickrather, begin to refuse licenses to Jewish contractors, or refuse to hire businesses they identify as owned by Jews, so that there are all sorts of new commercial relationships that are created, but Jews are more isolated commercially. By 1936, the Wickrather Lederfabrik and its owners had become increasingly vulnerable to this sort of aggression. And so the family decided to prevent attempts to expropriate the company after the Nuremberg laws come into play. And Zacharias' sons work with their house bank, the Saul Oppenheim Junior Bank, out of Cologne, to protect the firm. They bring in non-Jewish partners. They place their controlling stake in the company with the Oppenheim Bank, and they transfer the rest of their assets over the border to Holland, where they're trying to restart their business there in better conditions, or let's say conditions more conducive to Jews and more generally. In June 1936, however, the Gestapo gets wind of these efforts and arrests Louis and Victor, their wives, and Louis's son, Bobby. The Gestapo clearly, it's not clear exactly what the Gestapo does, but there's a massive amount of pressure on the family to surrender their controlling interest in the company and also admit to violating all sorts of laws, including German currency laws. Victor's wife actually commits suicide under this pressure. Eventually, the family is released because they refuse to admit to any wrongdoing, but they're required nevertheless to pay fines. I don't think this is a choice. I think this is simply a seizure of assets. Fines totaling 311,000 Reichsmark for alleged tax evasion, which is preposterous. And they're also forced to surrender ownership of the company. After their release, they bury Greiter, Victor's wife, and I just thought this was, this is really bizarre and sad, but very interesting. So first of all, I got this from a newspaper working out of Vienna. There were some people who were related to the Spier family in Vienna, and that might be part of the reason that it was reported on. But the other reason, as you can see, it says in Deutschland verboten. This is not a newspaper that could publish in Germany. I think what you're talking about is a network of information that about things that are happening to Jews that can't be reported directly in Germany. But this is a time when, although it is a dictatorship in Austria and there is a lot of anti-Semitism, nevertheless, you still have newspapers, you still have a Jewish press. So the point here is simply that the way the story goes is that as Greta is being buried, as the funeral is going on, the rabbi officiating is interrupted by local policemen in Wickrather who confiscate her coffin in a really bizarre attempt to stifle rumors that the Gestapo had murdered her, which seems like it would do exactly the opposite, but nevertheless, that is what happened. The family flees to Holland. It's pretty obvious that the Gestapo means them harm, and they try and rescue as much of their belongings, personal and otherwise, as they can. But those assets and personal belongings are seized by the Gestapo in 1938, when they're also deprived of their nationality, German nationality. And it's worth pointing out that the new firm, the firm's new CEO, Bruno Evers, actually works actively with the Gestapo to thwart the family's attempts to rescue their property. The same is true, actually, of Karl Dissmann, who had been Wickrat's mayor from 1919 to 1945. He's quite supportive of the Gestapo's attempts to dispossess the family. Here's just a picture of the largest part of the family. Remember, Zacharias had 7, he was one of 7, so this is a very large family. This is just Zacharias's family, and I think it includes everybody, but I'm not entirely sure about that, and I'm sure Heidi can correct me. In any case, the rest of the Spier family in Germany, as well as in the family in Holland, tried to escape the Nazis. Victor actually does escape, manages to flee to Britain, where he dies in 1945. One can say of natural causes, but obviously the loss of his wife and one of his sons, who dies in an accident, must have been an important factor in his death. The rest are rounded up and deported to various concentration camps, where most of them are murdered. Louis and Flo's daughters, Greiter Spier and Margaret Lichtenstein, are the ones who survive in this picture. Now, after 1945, the defeat of the Nazis, the Allies immediately revoke anti-Semitic laws and try and ensure restitution and compensation. But the German justice system doesn't actually work like the American and British one, so courts don't actually have to accept legal precedent established by other courts. And German courts are, in general, reluctant to rule in favor of Jews who've been dispossessed. There is an introduction of compensation law in 1953, but it requires constant revision. And I would argue that even the 1964 version of that law, which is more or less the one that is used afterwards, is really problematic. Most restitution and compensation cases are drawn out. And even then, it's hard to know how to value the businesses themselves. Just to give you 2 examples of that, Christians who purchase Jewish businesses at a discount under pressure to sell, the Jews end up having to flee or simply sell their businesses. And so the people who are purchasing those businesses are able to purchase them at a discount. They argue that the business that they purchased was in disarray when they purchased it, and that their management has allowed it to prosper. So how do you actually value the company in 1945, 1949, 1953, or 1964 when you're trying to understand what the original value might have been? Worse are cases where the new management actually ran it into the ground. Either they did that because of the war and it was beyond their control, or in fact, it was mismanagement. And this is a really big problem because there's nothing to be restituted. The company went bankrupt. So in this sense, Wickrat is a complete and unique case. I've never seen anything like this. One of the things I'm writing about is restitution and compensation. And this is the only instance that I've seen of anything like this. I think it has a lot to do with the Oppenheim Bank, and in particular, Friedrich Karl Freiherr von Oppenheim, whom you see at the top here, who was good friends with the family. But I don't think that it's simply about friendship. I think that it's also about doing what's right, trying as much as possible to return stolen property to its original owners. And so this is something that is done quickly. 1949 is very early, and it's done without any lawyers, without any kind of qualifications, handed over to the family once again. Ultimately, however, so let me just give you this. So the firm, and this is the reason that you see the dates that I chose here, 1855 to 1955, and you see the picture of Zacharias Spier here, and if I'm not mistaken, that's Friedrich Karl, but it's really hard for me to see. And here you see the list of the people who are speaking, and what's interesting about it is that it includes not only Friedrich Karl, but it's actually not on here, not on this particular one, but the vice chancellor of the West German Republic shows up, Franz Blücher, as well as here, you see it down here, Fritz Berg, the head of the Bundesverband der Deutschen Industrie, which is the most important lobbying group for industrialists. So it's a really big moment. It's a big moment in part for these politicians because they can say that the Nazis were an aberration in German history. They stole things from people, and private property is sacrosanct. And so that's why the Nazis are bad. But the problem is that they don't mention the Jewish part. There's no discussion of what had happened 10 years earlier and more whatsoever. It's just about restoring the property, not about the loss of life and the loss of happiness. And I think that's kind of what I want to say about the rest of the firm's history. One of the problems with the firm is that there's some destruction during the war. It's unclear to me that that it's managed well or not, but the firm doesn't do well after the war, in part because the tanning techniques are not competitive on world markets. And like I said, some of the machinery had been destroyed. So it's purchased in 1974, I believe it is, by a British firm, which ends up closing it down in 1990. And the town of Wickrather, actually, which becomes part of Mönchengladbach in 1975, does what German deindustrial areas tend to do. It repurposes these old manufacturing sites for the service sector. So this is the main building, which is now office space and apartments. There's several buildings that look like this. This is another building, a factory hall that has been turned into a beer brewery where you can also, there's a bar connected to it. And then here's the convention center, which Gerhard Schröder, for example, used in 2005 to launch his campaign to be reelected as chancellor, and some comedians use it from time to time too. So it's a useful return, if you like, to politics for the town, but the factory itself has disappeared. What you do have are the tripping stones, which of course the town itself doesn't make possible. This is done by private citizens, by Germans who either remember the factory and the fate of its owners and the family that was associated with it, or who are mindful of this gap, the fact that the factory no longer exists anymore, and try and commemorate what happened to them. I do want to point out, however, that this commemorates their murder. It says nothing about their lives. What's been lost, what's been effaced, are not only the physical signs of the presence of Jews, but also any kind of memory over time of their lives and whose lives they touched. In contrast, the town of Wickrather, now Mönchengladbach, still has a street named after that mayor that I mentioned, Karl Dissmann, which is a really problematic moment, it seems to me. It's hard to measure the kind of loss that we're talking about, both for the Spier family and the town of Wickrather. Everyone is gone, and it's really hard to remember something or someone you never knew. And I think that that's a kind of loss that's really hard to recognize for Germans and for us living here rather than over there. And I think that's where I'll end. So let me unshare there we go.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was really fascinating. I want to remind everyone, my name is David Brown. I'm Director of Programs and Communications at Leo Baeck Institute. And just want to remind everyone that we do have some time for questions, and there's a Q&A feature that if you move your mouse around a little bit, you'll see a sort of black bar at the bottom of the screen with some chat bubbles, and one of them says Q&A. So you can type your questions in there, and then we'll address them to Jonathan. I see. Yeah.
Do you want me to take or why don't you do? Why don't you?
Yeah. So we had one question that's sort of a straightforward factual question that seems like it could be straightforward. That came in early from Stan Lenkovsky, who asks, is it true that Jews were not allowed to settle in Saxony prior to 1871?
Well, that when you say settle, that's a complicated formulation, because Dresden did have a pretty vibrant Jewish community. I know more about Dresden than I know about Leipzig, just taking two larger cities. I don't think that these things were, how do I say this? Jews could, before the Napoleonic era, get the privilege of residing in a particular town or city, usually it had to go through the king or the prince, the duke, whoever it was. It really depended from German state to German state. So you're going to see lots of different kinds of regulations. There was an attempt to keep, most Jews are impoverished. There's an attempt to keep impoverished people in general outside of towns and cities. This is, the German cities, and it's Central Europe, it's not simply German. They would actually do all sorts of things to keep people out of cities who were either impoverished or were musicians. Musicians are always really dangerous. Storytellers, you can imagine all the sorts of people that we're talking about. And the idea was that they would somehow or another contribute both to more criminality on the one hand, but also they would be a burden on the city. So they would actually have people to beat people and keep them out of the city or simply incarcerate them. And of course, Jews, since they're understood as impoverished, are one of the more important groups, not the only groups, but one of the more important groups. So that's kind of common up until really after the Napoleonic Wars, and it's that 1842 Prussian law that changes everything for Prussia. So to come back to Saxony, there are so-called privileges that are extended to some Jews, but lots of Jews are essentially migrants. They're not able to settle in one place, and they have to figure out where they can settle. And there are all sorts of restrictions, and very often have to leave after a certain period of time, and sometimes can return and sometimes can't. And of course, there's paying all sorts of special taxes. Most German states follow Prussia when it comes to these issues around how municipalities should deal with the poor, and therefore also with Jews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's an important nuance there just between the concept of rights as we understand them today, rights that come with our own citizenship, and privileges, which sort of didn't mean that Jews didn't live in certain places, but it was, by special permission of some sovereign.
And the ability to pay those taxes, right?
Right. Yeah. And not just any Jews, but Jews with means to do so.
So, and it's worth pointing out just on that note, because I know a reasonable amount about Berlin during this period, that even after 1842, the Berlin Jewish community leaders worked with the Berlin police to keep certain kinds of Jews out of the city if they could. And the argument, again, so you do have the legal right to reside there, but the question is, can you fund yourself? And the Jewish community was always worried about the kind of pressure that it would get from the Prussian state and from Berlin's municipal authorities around, supposed Jewish criminality, but also the poor in general. So there was actually a kind of cooperation, which is not particularly edifying. It wasn't a good thing, I think, but nevertheless, Jewish communal leaders were involved in trying to preserve their communities from this influx of very often very poor people.
Great, thanks. We have another question from, forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Premislav Zarubin. What was the typical legal form of the Jewish business activity in the second half of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th in Germany? And do we know anything about employment structure in Jewish companies such as the Lederfabrik?
So I don't know, but I'm not sure I quite understand the question. I mean, if you have a small, there are different structures for German businesses. It's not until, gosh, I should know this off the top of my head and I don't remember, but it's basically not until after German unification, it's 1880 something, where you get the final laws that make it possible for companies to incorporate. So that's what more or less what Zacharias Spier does when he takes the company public. He has to incorporate it. That's an AG, or we would say, an incorporated firm. That's one structure. Another structure is a partnership where you do have shares. There are 100% of shares, but David and I have a business together. He gets 50% of it and I get 50% of it. We're not taking it public. It just remains our business relationship and a way of describing it in terms of dividing the profits. And then there are things like Kommanditgesellschaft, mainly for banks, but not only banks, where it's kind of like a legal partnership, but there can be different tiers of people who partake of profits. So there's all sorts of different forms. And when you say typical, what I would say is that as Jews enter the middle classes, and a lot of them become some kind of small business person, very often in retail, but not only in retail, they choose these kinds of structures to make sure that they retain control over the business, very few Jewish companies end up becoming listed on stock exchanges.
Thanks. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to a question from David Miola, who asks about Spier and his son's political affinities and how those relationships affected his business, philanthropic, and political decisions within the different eras, especially the 19th century. And how did they actually coincide with ground level emancipation politics and the devotion to Bildung and the quid pro quo that David Sorkin writes about?
Wait, so that was a hugely long
Yeah.
question.
Well, maybe let's just break it into pieces. First, what
about the
were
sons.
Spiers? Yeah, were they politically engaged, and how did that interface with their business and other commitments like social or philanthropic?
Yeah, so it's really hard to say anything about their politics. According to one document where the mayor of the town is reporting on Louis and Victor, the claim is that neither one of them were politisch auffällig, meaning that you can translate this or think about it in two different ways. Either neither one of them belonged to a political party, which I think is probably likely, although we probably could figure out who they voted for. But I think it actually probably refers to the idea that they weren't critical of the Nazis in public. In other words, they didn't do anything to stave off the rise of the Nazis. They were, at least in a public way, didn't do anything that might get them into a lot of trouble. And I think that the vulnerability, this is not a critique of them at all, the kind of vulnerability that Jewish entrepreneurs, especially a big factory in a small town during this period that had been subjected to a certain amount of aggression, I think that they were very smart probably not to do things like that, and it wouldn't have helped them very much. That said, in terms of the Jewish community, from what I can tell, and again, it's about interpreting a very tiny little bit of information. It's pretty clear that Victor was very involved in Jewish philanthropy, particularly around education. His wife, Greiter, the one who commits suicide, even more so. Louis seems to, I have one document that suggests that he had contact with German Zionists. That doesn't mean that he was a Zionist, but he did seem to have some contact with them. So it's really hard to reconstruct their politics. If I go back a little bit to that period before World War I, what you do see under, it's someone who, it's the management that is after Zacharias passes away and right before the brothers take it over, a man who's married to one of the Spier family. He is actually not progressive like Zacharias. And there's a moment in which you get a Catholic union to which most of the workers belong, and they go on strike. And his method of dealing with it is rather harsh. And the factory definitely wins, but reading between the lines in terms of what seems to be going on the factory floor level, a lot of the goodwill seems to have evaporated at that moment that Zacharias Spier had built up with the workers. So you're not talking about a family that's on the left. I don't think you could make that argument. It wouldn't make any sense if you're that large of an entrepreneur. That doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't liberal, though.
There were a few questions about their social engagement with their employees and the housing complex. Can you say anything more about that?
I don't, there's so little information on it. What I do know is that Zacharias is the one who takes the initiative to build this housing. You could make certain kinds of arguments about the housing itself. They're not apartment buildings. They're, what would you say, the Reihenhäuser, they're not all in a line, but there's several families living inside of them. So we haven't moved to a model of individual private property for the working class. That's not what you're seeing. But they're subsidized, and apparently the subsidies from the numbers that I could find, it's actually pretty good for workers. It's quite good, and so that there are a lot of workers who do want to take him up on it. There's another set of buildings that are built under this guy's Wettendorf after Zacharias passes away, and I want to say it's 1907, but I can't remember the date accurately offhand. But there are more buildings workers' residences that are built, but they're apparently not nearly as generous, both in terms of the subsidies that are offered to workers, reduced rent, and all kinds of maintenance that go along with that, as well as the space. So again, it's this kind of moment where perhaps the firm is doing really well or not, and there's maybe a squeeze on margins. And this is one of the ways in which they're still trying to attract workers as they become larger, but at less generous terms.
Thanks. I'm just looking for the next question. I was trying to listen and read questions at the same time, which is probably not quite the right way to do things.
No, I'm thankful that you're doing it, because if I had to read the questions, I would.
There are so many, and there are really good ones. So I'm sorry that we're not going to get to them all, but we'll definitely do a few more. So here's a question from Jill Bauer, who writes that she at one time read that Jewish businesses in Germany comprised a disproportionate amount of entrepreneurial enterprises compared to the percentage of Jews as part of the total population. I'm sure there's no ill intent in the use of the word disproportionate, but that's also like a problematic concept, right? I mean, this is sort of what you hear, from the National Socialists. But on the other hand, I'm sure you've studied Jewish entrepreneurship, and perhaps you could say something about, Jews' role in certain sectors, in relation to their,
I would start by saying that when you talk about Germany, it's really hard to talk about Germany because, as everybody knows, I think, who's attended the lecture, it's such a even inside of Prussia, the kinds of things that go on in the West, in the Rhineland area, even some of the legal strictures on Jews are different than the legal strictures on Jews in eastern part of Prussia. So talking about Germany is really hard. And when you talk about numbers, about Jews in particular, there's two problems that I've encountered, and I've been writing about this from the early 19th century to the eve of World War I. When you look at the generation of numbers, the actual production by, say, Prussia or Baden or another one of the duchies on what Jews are doing in the commercial sphere, first of all, there's an enormous amount of anti-Semitism. Just to give you a quick example of that, the idea is that Jews don't work with their hands. They're not productive, right? They're parasitic in this sense. And so there's an attempt by the Badenese government to demonstrate that that's true. And so they toss everybody into the group of peddlers. And the problem is that a lot of these people, you can't describe them as peddlers, and some people might actually be manufacturing things. For example, Zacharias Spier initially manufactures leather hide that he sells to other manufacturers of leather goods, but he also makes his own leather goods. So how do you classify someone like that? Well, if you want to demonstrate that no one is productive who's Jewish, then you say he's simply a retailer, which is simply not true. So there's the anti-Semitic moment, and then there's the fact that some states produce numbers and a lot of them don't at all. There are internal reports, but those internal reports are based on anecdotes. So the first problem I have as a scholar is, how do I put all this together? What usually happens is people study, like Abraham Bakai did, a particular area. And in my case, I am looking at Prussia. I'm looking at the reports that the Prussian government starts to produce after 1871. And what you can see is something like this, that it's true that the two things that distinguish the Jewish population compared to the non-Jewish population in Germany, Christian, meaning both Catholic as well as Protestant, inside of Prussia, is that there are very few working class people, if you define those people as factory workers. But if you define them as people who work with their hands, lots of Jews are involved in putting up wallpaper, in plumbing, in being butchers. I mean, a butcher, that's a small business, but a lot of the people who put up wallpaper don't own their own business. So there's lots of Jews who actually are working with their hands, but they don't get classified as workers. And there aren't as many factory workers in terms of the proportion of, when it comes to the Jewish population, in terms of if you compare it to the proportion of the Christian populations. And there are more factory workers, you can make the argument, in the Protestant population, partly because of where industry is. Okay, and the second thing is that there are fewer Jewish farmers. It's not that there aren't any Jewish farmers, but there are fewer. So those are the two things that are usually used by anti-Semites to say Jews don't work with their hands. And like I said, my pushback is, well, what about all of the people who I think we would call them contractors today, but are actually working with their hands? They're just not in factories. So there's more to the question, I think, but I don't know, David, I'm sure I left a lot out here.
Well, I don't think we could ever cover it all, but I think that was a good general overview. So let's. I think we're probably coming to the end of our time, so it might be a good moment to sort of zoom out and ask what a few people in the Q&A have asked, which is how you came to this research, this particular. And I think people are interested both in how you came to the particular family and business, and then maybe you could also just talk a little bit generally about, what you think the relevance and importance of studying economic history is, and business history of specific enterprises, and what can we learn from that today?
Yeah, let me flip it. I'll start with the business history. So I was trained as a German historian, was interested in East Germany and in communism, and I think when you're dealing with communism, one of the things that is really important is the labor movement and the working class, and class is a way to understand people's position in society and what their economic interests are, but how that translates into politics and culture. And I think over time, what became really clear to me is that that's a extremely useful way to analyze society, but a lot of things drop out. And ethnicity and culture and confession are some of those things. And even in reading, for example, Stasi files, I was really shocked to see that for a government that prided itself on being egalitarian, that there was an enormous amount of anti-Semitism between the lines, sometimes open, sometimes not. But it was rather shocking, and it might not shock us today because now we know a lot about all the sorts of things that the GDR was involved in. But I think at the time, and I was reading documents starting in 91, 92, it was very shocking to me. And there's no way to get close to that if you're using class as a way to understand things. So over time, I became more and more interested in ethnicity and confession. And the thing that I discovered is that Jewish history is very often poorly integrated into German history. So if you read anything as someone who's trained as a German historian, it's usually about anti-Semitism. And this is the point that I was trying to make at the end of the talk. It's not that anti-Semitism is a problematic thing to study. It's actually very important. And the differences between anti-Semitism and the overlaps as well between anti-Semitism and racism, all very important. But what anti-Semitism leaves out are Jewish people's lives. And German history we focus on women, we focus on the working class, we focus on different people's actual lives, but we don't focus on Jewish lives. So over time, what I began to realize is that it would be really useful to try and integrate Jewish history into German history so that people who read and write about Germany understand a little bit more, not only about the contributions, but about what actually happened to Jews. And that means also this legacy that I was talking about, this tremendous loss, not only for the victims themselves and for the people who did survive but were forced to go somewhere else or who didn't want to return, but also for Germans. I think Germans are struggling to recognize what this kind of loss has meant to them. And so that's how I see this kind of work. And so if you think about Jews, you can't simply talk about for example, what goes on in the synagogue. I do become very interested in Jewish communal life and tzedakah in particular. But at the same time, tzedakah is always related to the kind of economic activity that people are engaged in or can't be engaged in. So that's the pathway into this book that I've been writing for far too long.
And what about the Wickrather Lederfabrik?
Yeah, so this was accidental. One of the things that the book goes from 1790 to 1990, and obviously the Nazi period is very important. And one of the things that I wanted to do is push back a little bit on the literature about German banks, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. And I wanted to oppose what some people have written about the Deutsche Bank to some of the private banks. And we know a lot about, for example, the Warburg Bank, thanks to a couple of colleagues of mine, we don't know anything about the Oppenheim Bank, partly because there aren't that many sources. And so I, in taking a look at their records, came across very brief mention in one of the very large Akten, the folders, to the Wickrather. And as I began to think about the Oppenheim Bank and why it restituted a business like this so quickly and without any kind of, and yet didn't even brag about it, which banks, businesses do all the time. I just became more and more interested in it and tried to find out as much as I possibly could. And it's both that unique moment where it's an exception. I have not come up with another example of a company that's been restituted in this way that quickly without any lawyers, but also the story itself. And I saw in the chat that Heidi was interested in me talking about the 1955 celebration, which really is all about this kind of collision between Jewish survivors and the way they want to talk about what happened to them, and the inability and even refusal of West Germans to be able to even admit that there was a genocide, much less whatever their own personal entanglements were. Franz Blücher, the vice chancellor, was involved in expropriating Jews, for example. And it's really hard even at this point to talk about these things. So I think that's the case study itself is an avenue into opening up all kinds of German histories and trying to understand and put the Jewish part back in, if you like, and not just leave it up to anti-Semitism.
Jonathan Zatlin, thank you very much for your lecture and for taking the time to answer our audience's questions. And I hope that when you finish that book that you'll come back and tell us about it. That sounds fascinating. This is the fantasies of Jewish wealth in Germany, right?
Right.
Sounds very interesting. Thanks for your talk today. And I just want to thank everyone who came and listened in and asked such great questions.
Me too. Thank you to everybody. And thanks for the opportunity, David.
Yeah, it was our pleasure.